What a fine school this is. Beautiful place, interesting people. Big question is it going to be enough for the challenges that are facing us? The title for my talk is Ecological Agriculture for an Ecological Civilization. What I'm wanting us to think about tonight is what do we do to replace the industrial mind that has given us everything from climate change to an increase in soil erosion, fossil fuel dependency, chemical contamination of the land and water, and so on. But to begin our thinking about that, I want us to think about soil. This happens to be the United Nations FAO, or Food and Agriculture Organization, declared year of soil. And that has a huge effort behind it by the United Nations. And it's none too soon for us to be thinking about the stuff we're made of, that over the course of a year, we're losing about 30 million acres a year due to land degradation, according to the United Nations. So I want to talk about some basic facts to help get us started. Fact number one: soil is more important than oil. And fact number two: as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. I want to come back to the second one. That first fact is easy, more important than oil. The second one, that it is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil, is a little harder to comprehend. So I'll come back to that. But before I do that, I want to go to the third, I'll call it fact. Chris Field, a professor at Stanford University and the Carnegie Institute of Washington, an ecologist who has done a global inventory of nature's ecosystems, has concluded that natural ecosystems generally have greater net primary production than the human-managed systems that follow. In other words, nature does a better job at accumulating the ecological capital than the human-managed systems that follow. That's the third, I'll call it, fact. And four, we are likely, well, if we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. My friend Chuck Washburn, the late Chuck Washburn, said to me many years ago that statement. And what he went on to say is that agriculture ultimately has a discipline standing behind it. And that discipline is ecology and evolutionary biology. The materials sector, the industrial sector, has no discipline standing behind it. Therefore, if we're to look at how we're going to develop sustainable systems across the board for humanity, agriculture becomes the place to begin. So, just to have a recap for those three, before I move on to number 4 and 5. Soil is more important than oil. Soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil, and we're going to come back to that. And natural ecosystems have greater net primary production than the human-managed systems that follow. And if we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. Now, number 5, land use is number 2 as a source of greenhouse gases, behind power plants and ahead of all transportation. Some of that has to do with deforestation, but if we take the deforestation for the purpose of the expansion of agriculture, in the tropics, for instance, for growing corn and soybeans, then agriculture is about equal to all transportation. So it's behind power plants and ahead of all transportation, air transportation, surface transportation, and so on. And number 6, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report said that agriculture is the greatest threat to wild biodiversity. So that's quite a list that centers around agriculture. And count that as something of an outline of a warm-up to what I'm going to be saying later. First of all, to deal with the problem of how agriculture is as much of a non-renewable, soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. This is hard for people to internalize because there are so many gardens that have been improved, so many agricultural fields that have been improved. Therefore, how can you say that? I have seen my garden improved. I have seen my agricultural field improved. Well, I'm here to tell you what has happened is those that are involved in that improvement of the garden and the field have been engaged in what I will call an acceptable theft from somewhere else, unacknowledged. Whether it's the coffee grounds that get picked up and put on the organic garden or whatever. So I want to explain by giving a couple of examples. The first example comes from Mendocino County, California. That's north of San Francisco, an hour and a half or so, up around Jug Handle State Park. There are 5 terraces. Each one of those terraces has been developed over about 100,000 years. What happens is that the Pacific plate is sliding under the continental plate, and so next to the ocean is Terrace 1, which is grassy, but also with some redwood and Doug fir coming in. Terrace 2 is, the first one is 100,000 years old. Terrace 2 is 200,000 years old. Terrace 3, 300,000. Terrace 4, 400,000. And Terrace 5, 500,000. In Terrace 2 is a lot of redwood and Doug fir. Terrace 3 is a transition zone of sorts with a lot of Jeffrey pine coming in. Terrace 4 is what's called pygmy forest. And Terrace 5 is also pygmy forest. So if one were to collect the biomass, the standing crop above the surface, at Terrace 2, say, where the redwood and the Doug fir is, over a square kilometer or an acre, and weigh it up, there's a lot of biomass there in that redwood and Doug fir. If one were to harvest over a similar area in Terrace 4 or 5, there's not much biomass. So the soil scientists have taken soil probes within these natural ecosystems of humanity, and starting either, I don't really know whether they started at the ocean or whether they started in Terrace 5, but they took probes, and what they found was that the elements that go into making organisms, the basic elements, not the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, or the nitrogen, which comes out of the atmosphere, but in the upper third of the periodic chart are those elements, 20-some, manganese, sulfur, calcium, and so on, that are necessary for life. Those elements, over time, in spite of the natural ecosystem being there to hold them, those elements are leaching downward. So, big question. Why are there not pygmy forests, pygmy prairies, pygmy whatever all over the planet? Well, because we have mountain uplift, we have glaciers, like the glaciers of the Ice Age that scraped the nutrients off the Canadian Shield to give us Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and northeast Kansas and Nebraska over 1.8 million years. That's what made those states rich in soils, because of those nutrients being scraped that had accumulated as a result of geologic activity somewhere else. So the Rocky Mountains uplift, creating the materials that go into life, bringing them up. The Sierra Nevada, the Coast Range, which gave us the Great Valley of California. And we're lucky because our agriculture is the product of that geologic activity. Why is Australia a poor country, a poor continent? It's poor because its last geologic activity was 65 million years ago, and it's going to stay poor. It simply has not had the geologic activity to provide those nutrients for the development of the relationship of the organisms, the microbes, to work with what the green plants are able to do in the creation of soil. And if that isn't enough, I'll just give you another little fact or two. There's been a recent study of the southeastern slope looking at 10 river basins of the southeastern slopes of the Appalachians. What they found is that before settlement from the European, that those mountains were losing about 8/1000ths of a meter per 1,000 years. 8/1000. So if you imagine a meter at 39 inches, so that's down, not much is being lost. But once the cutting of the forest and the development of agriculture in those mountains, now losing about 950 millimeters, almost a full meter per 1,000 years. So where is the soil going? To the base of the hillsides, and some of it into the rivers and on to the ocean. So that is the supporting language behind the statement that soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. Now, let's keep that in mind, because we're living with the illusion in the sustainable ag movement that we can improve soil, but we don't go to the next step by acknowledging that when we do, it's the consequence of having engaged in an acceptable theft from somewhere else on the planet of the fertility. All right, now I want to move on to a basic food fact. Some 70 to 75% of our acreage worldwide for agriculture is devoted to grains. Some 75% of our calories, 70 to 75% of our calories is coming from some 70 to 75% of our acreage, coming from grains. The number one grain of the planet in terms of calories, the number one crop in terms of calories, is rice. Rice happens to be number two in acreage. The number two crop of the planet is wheat. It's number one in acreage. The number three crop of the planet is corn or maize. The number four is potato, and then after that we're into grains and legumes and grass. So the grass family and the legume family is largely responsible for sustaining us, and they are all annuals. So the agricultural revolution, which began some 10 to 12,000 years ago at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where it's drying out at the end of the Pleistocene, there the greatest group of revolutionaries to ever live began the journey to give us all of our crops and livestock, starting with the wheat plant, probably from the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. So we are primarily eaters of the grasses, the legumes, members of the sunflower family for the oilseed crops. So we can get into the question of how all this started. And that's an important consideration that the time limit does not allow us to do it justice, except that we can say that we've been around with the big brain for 150 to 200,000 years, and we've had agriculture only some 10,000 years. Therefore, it's only about 5% of our evolutionary history with the big brain that we have been engaged in widespread soil degradation due to the growing of the annual grain crops and also other vegetables and so on, but primarily the grains. So if we are to solve the 10,000-year-old problem of agriculture, we have to feature the perennial rather than the annual, so that we're not tearing the ground up every year and leaving it subject to the forces of wind and rain. I want to tell you a little bit of the journey that we at the Land Institute have been on to solve that 10,000-year-old problem and get at the beginning. How did we get started? Well, in 1977, I read the General Accounting Office study that was put out in order to look at the efficacy of the Soil Conservation Service. Is the money being well spent? is, of course, the question of the FAO. And it looked to me as though we were losing soil in 1977 about as fast as we were losing it when the Soil Conservation Service was formed in the 1930s, led by the energetic and imaginative chief of the Soil Conservation Service, Hugh Hammond Bennett. That started in 1933, not long after Roosevelt came into office. And looking at that study and thinking about it, I thought, how can this be? Thousands of miles of terraces, grass waterways, an organization put together with great esprit de corps, devoted to the common task of saving our soils. And the great Hugh Hammond Bennett, Ph.D. in soils, author of a major book, was from North Carolina, grew up along the Ph.D. River, and he was an impassioned man. Not too many people study the history of Hugh Hammond Bennett, but he should be studied and read. So, having read that report and knowing about the Soil Conservation Service's effort, I happened to take my interns, the students, on a field trip to the Konza Prairie. The Konza Prairie is thousands of acres of prairie that's never been plowed, a beautiful area. And the ecologist, Lloyd Holbert, a good plant ecologist, prairie ecologist, gave us a wonderful tour. And as we sat around and looking at this system, I thought, here's a prairie. There's no soil erosion beyond natural replacement levels, no fossil fuel dependency, no introduction of chemicals that our tissues have no evolutionary experience with, no introduction of commercial fertilizer. Here's a sustainable system. What's the deal here? These are primarily grasses and legumes, members of the sunflower family, warm season grasses, cool season grasses, a sustainable system, and yet all around us are these fields which are dependent upon the extractive economy. The difference? Well, let's see. That prairie features perennials grown in mixtures, a perennial polyculture. Our agricultural system features annuals grown in monocultures. What's wrong? Well, that prairie produces a lot of forage, but it produces seeds, but not seeds for humanity. So the question occurred, is it possible to perennialize the major crops, corn, wheat, sorghum, sunflower, soybeans? Is it possible to then grow them in mixtures that would mimic the vegetative structure of a never plowed prairie, so that all we do is harvest and manage that perennial grain producing system with fire and grazing? That was the question. That's what set me off. Well, I did I started out in plant taxonomy, and if you're a taxonomist, one of the things you do is you're used to keying out plants. And so I'm going to show you, well, I'm not going to tell you about these guys. The guy on the left is Charles Darwin, and the guy on the right is Alfred North Whitehead. And the reason I put these two up here is that these are sort of the two fathers of our basic thinking. Darwin, who gave us an evolutionary ecological worldview, and Alfred North Whitehead, who taught us process thinking and is the one that said that the essence of dramatic tragedy lies not in unhappiness, but in the remorseless, inevitable working of things, that caused me to ask, is agriculture in the nature of a dramatic tragedy? We've got to have food, and yet we have to destroy its potential over the long term. And so that's the reason I put that slide in. Now, so what I want to show you here is the thinking that led to the journey that we're on. I don't know if you can see, well, it doesn't show up very well, but there are four kinds of considerations that come from this kind of dichotomous thinking. So we have monocultures and we have polycultures. We have woody plant forms and herbaceous plant forms. See the second column. We have some plants that are annual and some plants that are perennial. And then we have the product. Some of the plants we want the vegetative part, like we want salads, for instance. And some plants we want the reproductive parts. So I drew up these 16 different combinations. Well, 4 of those combinations are irrational or nonsensical. For instance, at the top, a monoculture of woody plants that are annual and at the same vegetative is nonsensical because there are no woody annuals. Got the picture? Woody annuals are out. So you wipe those out, that leaves 12 combinations. And you start filling in on those various combinations, a monoculture of woody perennials for the vegetative part would be a woodlot of one species, and so on. If you come down to a polyculture of herbaceous annuals for vegetative, that'd be a pasture. But 11 of those 12 categories is accommodating the human interest in some way, but there is one category that was not filled, and that is polyculture of herbaceous perennial fruit seed plants. And that just blinked. Why that vacancy? So that's sort of the beginning. And so that's the blank that the Land Institute set itself the task of trying to fill. Herbaceous, perennial, seed-producing polycultures. So I wrote that up in a paper that was published in '78, and then my book, New Roots for Agriculture, came out in 1980. Now, my fellow scientists considered this impossible, and they had good reason to feel it was impossible. And it's because of something, and this is important from the point of view of the history of science. It was considered impossible because of what's known as a rather famous equation among ecologists. It's called the R and K selection formula. So let me go into that a bit. It began with clutch size in birds. In birds, they found that the more eggs within a clutch, the less likely would be the parents to protect them. If you have a few eggs, they really are careful about protecting. So in animals generally, and are selected from an evolutionary point of view, an R-selected individual allocates its resources to reproduction, and a K-selected species allocates its resources to hanging in there. So, mice are R-selected, elephants are K-selected. And this all began with clutch size in birds. So the plant people said, I wonder, is this also true among plants? That a plant that allocates its resources to reproduction, like annual grains, that's R-selected. A perennial plant allocating its resources to hanging in there over time, that's K-selected. Well, there's one admonition we should all keep in mind. Be careful what you seek, for you will surely find. And they found examples among plants that, sure enough, were following the R and K reality. It makes it into the textbooks. And everybody just knows that a plant that allocates so much to the root will not be able to have much to allocate toward the seed. Well, I understood that. But the problem was, what about fruit trees and nut trees that have high yields? They're perennials. What's going on here? And we're going to come back to that later on. Well, that was sort of waved off because there were also examples with the herbaceous. So I saw the roots as kind of an investment rather than a major cost. Annuals have to build a root system every year. Perennials will have some sloughing off, of course, but nevertheless, the idea of a physiological trade-off between roots and seeds prevailed. Well, the nice thing about science is that if you have data and you publish in refereed journals, it doesn't matter what the opinion is or the critics say. So our research got underway very early, in about actually 78, and so we began at what I call the first inventory stage. And it's very modest compared to what I'll describe later. But any plant that was herbaceous, perennial, got a 5-meter long row at the Land Institute. Herbaceous, perennial, and winter hardy. So we did this inventory, and for instance, we noted that out on our native prairie, and we have over 160 acres of native prairie, about 90 of it is a result of never having been plowed, that there are what we call 4 functional groups: warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, and members of the sunflower family. And wherever there is prairie, we have those functional groups, whether it's the Canadian provinces, short grass prairie, out in Colorado or whatever, or over into Ohio. So we selected a few candidates for this inventory of the 4 functional groups, and we began the research. My background's in genetics, so the first thing is to see, can we breed? Can we do 2 possibilities: domesticate some wild perennial candidates, or cross wild relatives of wheat and sorghum and sunflowers and corn and create perennials. And by the way, when I published on this, I said this is going to take 50 to 100 years. We developed the motto, if you're working on something that you can finish in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. So, David Van Tassel, Ph.D., University of California, Davis, is working on the sunflower family, working on more than 2 different species in that family. And by the way, that's a very important family because these are oil seed crops that are very important in the human diet and other things. But David Van Tassel has been crossing the domestic sunflower with various wild relatives. He also is working with the closely related genus called Silpium, and we'll have a little more on that later. We have Stan Cox, who he just got back from Uganda in Africa. There was a combination of the meeting of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We also have a postdoc from Uganda, Fiona, that is going to take the perennial sorghum developed at the Land Institute to 5 different countries in Central Africa. And people seem surprised when I say this, but most of the farmers of the world are women. Asia, Africa, Latin America, and industrial societies, they're men. But what the women want in Africa, the farmers, they don't want flowering and seed set all at once. They want the flowering to be spaced so they can harvest today, have their gruel, harvest 3 days later, have gruel, and so on. In industrialized society, we want it to be harvested all at once. So out of Stan Cox's germplasm will be selection for both lines. The short, all-at-once harvest, as well as the spacing of it. So this is Stan with some of the perennial sorghum that is in Africa. If it's not in all 5 countries, it will soon. Lee Hahn came to us, Ph.D., University of Minnesota, as a plant breeder, and Lee was crossing intermediate wheatgrass with wheat in order to have the maximum yield within the perennial wheat. He was selecting for high yield in the wild perennial intermediate wheatgrass. And he noticed that the response to selection was so dramatic that we put him on domesticating the intermediate wheatgrass as a crop unto itself and hired Xu Wang to work on the hybrid wheats. This plant is going to be the plant, the first plant to be added to the human inventory as useful. There are farmers now in Iowa and southern Minnesota that are growing this plant and selling the seed to make flour to Patagonia, the company, and also to we're getting the basics to make whiskey and beer out of. I'm going to show you in a moment a photograph about what we call Konza, which is Thenopyrum intermedium or intermediate wheatgrass. And then Xu Wang, who is now doing what Stan was doing, working to develop perennial wheat. His germplasm is in 21 different sites in 8 different countries being tested. And this is Xu. This is Xu he makes all of his crosses within the greenhouse. And then Fenghui in China were supporting the perennialization of the upland rice. And by the way, they're now talking about the perennialization of the paddy rice. And by the way, from the point of view of the Chinese government, they're interested in the perennialization of rice generally, including the paddy rice, because it's women that are the farmers. Women that are not involved in that sort of heavy work become increasingly empowered, and empowered women want fewer children. So here is a social product in a change in an agronomic circumstance. And then our director of research, Tim Cruz, is working to develop perennial legumes in the mix of the perennial other perennial grains. So to come back, I want to show you the Konza, which is a trademark name. I want to show that to you, and I'm going to need a little bit of help. All right. Here is the plant that started civilization. That's the wheat plant, the eastern end of the Mediterranean. This is actual size, and this is an annual, and here is the kind of plant that'll save civilization. A perennial, they're year-round, and imagine now, on the prairies, when we came across the continent and cutting the prairie vegetation with the shear, the plowshare, that's organic matter. That's carbon. I'm betting that the beginning of climate change began 10,000 years ago when we destroyed the perennial vegetative structure starting at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, because that's atmospheric carbon. So imagine now reestablishing over our agricultural acreage perennial grains that will, in the long run, out-yield these annuals. Look how much total biomass there is above ground. And when you have all that biomass, what you're out to do is improve the harvest index. And by harvest index, you start with right here above the surface, take all the calories, and what percent of the calories are devoted to the grain versus the vegetative. Through breeding, we have moved the harvest index in wheat to 0.5, which is to say half of the calories in the wheat plant are in the grain. Right now, like a quarter of the calories are in the seeds of the Konza. So there's more total biomass, even though we may not get the same harvest index, although we'll work toward increasing the harvest index. That this is one reason that the perennials will out-yield the annuals. Well, after I'll be working on the harp when that happens, but that'll be something that will happen if they stick to it. So we can just lay this down here. Thank you. So we're now filling that blank at the bottom. And it's worthwhile. I hope you can read this. But if you note, the last time we have had a new crop was 3,500 years ago. It's cacao. So this would be the first new crop in 3,500 years. In a moment, I'll tell you what Thomas Jefferson had to say about that. So we have numerous connections around the world with various institutions. So when we talk about the institutionalization of an ecological worldview, beginning with agriculture. We're talking about the institutionalization of a research program paradigm, and we can point to various faculty in various places now around the globe. In Minnesota, University of Georgia, Texas A&M, South Dakota State, I mentioned Shuin in 8 different counties, St. Louis University, Missouri Botanical Garden, University of Manitoba, Australia, Uganda, China, Mali, Ethiopia, and so on. And finally, the endorsement of established institutions, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council, the Royal Society, the Food and Agriculture Organization of Rome. The World Bank has visited us twice, and the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. So now for a big story. We've always had this big question on our minds. Why did our ancestors not develop perennial grains? Was it success with the annuals? And surely the question was asked thousands of times over the millennia. Why must we plow every year and be bothered by thistles and thorns and sweat of the brow? The plowshare has destroyed more options for future generations than the sword. To take a swipe at Isaiah. Well, we can now answer, as a result of 3 of our scientists having published 2 papers in refereed journals, of why our ancestors did not develop perennial grains and why we can now. And it has to do with 4 steps which led them to a rich insight, a kind of a Sherlock Holmes effort. I won't get too much into the detail other than to say that annuals tend to self-accept their own pollen. And that means it's very tight inbreeding, and if a mutation arises, it's quickly eliminated if it's lethal. If a desirable trait, like resistance to shatter, the seed to shatter, before we can harvest it, it can be quickly fixed. Perennials tend to outcross, and therefore when mutations arise, they can be covered by the normal genes. There's a buildup of what we call genetic load, or mutational load, which we in our time can now purge. We can grow out thousands of plants. We have modern molecular tools, and we have the computational power of our time. Our ancestors lacked both the knowledge and the technical ability. But now I want to tell you about a more ambitious inventory than the one that we started early. I was talking to people at St. Louis University and the Missouri Botanical Garden. And I was saying we need to do an inventory of all of the wild, herbaceous, grain plants from the tropics to the temperate zone. They got excited because their computers are tied to all the major botanical gardens of the world and also the major herbaria. And so there's a funding of a 3-year inventory of all the wild, herbaceous, perennial, hard-seeded, that is, without fleshy material, of grasses, legumes, and oil seeds of the world. It's a $500,000 project over 3 years. But now we can begin to imagine tens, perhaps hundreds, of potential perennial grains. I'm imagining grad students and postdocs, each one of them picking a wild species and domesticating it and adding it to the human inventory devoted to saving the soils. And given that it will be from the tropics to the temperate zone, we can now imagine those species coming together and giving us those efficiencies that are inherent within the natural integrities of a wild ecosystem. So there's no soil erosion, no fossil fuel dependency, no introduction of chemicals we've not evolved with. We will be able in time to solve the 10,000-year-old problem of agriculture. So you can see how long it's been since we've had any new species added. And here is our intermediate wheatgrass. The bad thing about this photo, it's a monoculture. But that's been there some 7 years. It's more or less weed-free. We harvest the grain, and in fact, and now for the movie. So I'm going to now tell you, since you've seen the harvest of the first perennial grain in the history of the earth, I don't know a good way to tell you this story without using a word that I don't like. These new species, being perennial, means we will be adding new, and forgive me, hardware to grain agriculture. The old annual grain hardware has always limited the potential of the kind of software we've used for 10,000 years. One has to tear the ground up every year or drench with an herbicide for starters. The new hardware, meaning the perennial, now makes it possible to draw on a new science of software. And where does it come from? It comes out of ecology and evolutionary biology. All that knowledge, which has been accumulating on the shelf for 150 years, mostly useless for agriculture, in our time, an ecosystem-based agriculture will allow more of the processes of nature's ecosystem to be captured and begin to appear on the agricultural landscape of the world from the tropics to temperate zones. Remember, it's perennial polyculture. And we can now imagine moving more aggressively away from annual monocultures to perennial polycultures toward what is called ecological intensification. Last October, we hosted 50 scientists from around the world to a meeting at Estes Park, Colorado. Those 50 scientists from all over the world were mostly young, coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, from Argentina, Australia, Canada, China, Ethiopia, Italy, Mali, South Africa, Sweden, and many of them, the leadership, were women, young Ph.D.s. So in thinking about the future, if we can keep ourselves fed, we can get through this long tunnel that's facing it. So what does the future look like for agriculture? The end of soil erosion, the end of fossil fuel dependency, greatly reduced use of chemicals we've not evolved with, more eyes to acres. The future farmer will have a mentality more like that of a 19th century British naturalist than the current modern dirt farmer. We're talking about the end of thistles and thorns and sweat of the brow. So in addressing the title of this talk, Ecological Agriculture for an Ecological Civilization, what we are addressing as a corollary is an ecological worldview as counter to the industrial mind. So rather than ask, how would such an agriculture fit into an ecological civilization, I'll return to a statement by my late friend Chuck Washburn, who said, if we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. Agriculture which uses nature as the standard or measure is drawing on the discipline of ecology. The materials sector, the industrial sector, has no discipline to draw on. And as we seek to have agriculture come into phase with nature's standard, become more isomorphic with it, what can we expect as offering for society generally? Nature's ecosystem has tight nutrient cycling. Short feedback loops become the metaphor. Currently, our civilization is dependent upon long feedback loops where there's interruption. A second consideration that we learn out of ecology and evolutionary biology, and that is that the internal control of a system is more energy and materials efficient than the external control of a system. And a good example is the biological nitrogen fixation that we see in the prairie or the forest. Now get this, my friends. The rhizobium bacterium that attaches to the legume root uses 4/5 of 1 atmosphere and ambient temperature, along with 21 enzymes, to do what the most important invention of the 20th century does, starting in 1909, the Haber-Bosch process, which requires not 4/5 of 1 atmosphere, but 350 atmospheres, not at ambient temperatures, but 400 degrees C. So here is an example of an efficiency inherent within the natural integrity, and a new set of metaphors becomes available for society generally. The law of return, described by Sir Albert Howard, speaks to the nature of recycling. And then what we know already from the work of Jack Ewell in Costa Rica, where we mimic the structure of the surrounding nature, we're granted almost always the function. So, as I approach the end of this talk, I want to give you Gary Snyder's poem, which appeared at the end of his Pulitzer Prize-winning volume, Turtle Island. And it's called For the Children. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us. The steep climb of everything going up, up, as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. to climb these coming crests, these meaning population growth, resource depletion, environmental degradation. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, go light. Now we at the Land Institute are contributors to those rising hills with our technology. Our pickup trucks, our tractors, our greenhouses, our computers, the technology which makes this possible. And here is a big question. Will all that technology, which includes the sequencing of the genome of Konza, will include sophisticated use of computers and GPSs and so on, will all of that technology used to bring these new species and varieties into existence be required on the other side of those slopes that Gary Snyder talks about? And I say the answer is no. Their creatureliness will make them available even to a Neolithic farmer. The industrial world cannot make that claim. For solar collectors, wind machines, whatever it may be, they will require the industrial mind and its products to be sustained. So, in our time, in the last couple of centuries, we've answered two of the three old religious questions. Where we have come from. We now know we're stardust. We know that the carbon which enters in our bodies was cooked in the remote past of a dying star. We know that at lower temperatures came nitrogen and oxygen, and these indispensable elements were spewed into space to mix planets and form and we ourselves. We now know that the ancient atmospheres molded our metabolism. We now know that the ancient seas set the pattern of ions in our blood. We've not answered the third old religious question of what is to become of us. And in our scriptures, we were promised a new heaven and a new earth. The astrophysicists have given us the new heaven. And it's up to us to come up with the new earth. So in one sense, we're like Dante, entering a dark wood. There is neither map nor guide. Dante had Virgil for the trip through hell. In our time, we're all hoping to avoid several kinds of hell as we make our way through the dark woods. Or if you prefer, maybe what we're entering is more desert-like, but with no Moses or commandments in stone. But from my point of view, it matters but little that we have neither map nor guide. We have something better. We have affection for our ecosphere and the will to negotiate a corrective course. We have our institutions, we have our schools, our colleges, our universities, our nonprofits, even governments to transform and use. So agriculture and the formal culture have historically stood behind cultural advances and declines. But so has, for all practical purposes, non-renewable carbon. It hasn't mattered whether the operating system of ideas features gods or God, or the divine right of kings, or private property, or universal human rights. As land animals, we're land animals. Our land-based dependency has been always in the thinking. T.S. Eliot's little getting from the Fourth Quartet. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. The discovery of the world lies before us. So far, we've only colonized it. The 10,000-year agriculture period, predicated upon destruction and the necessity for us to eat and give us the kind of knowledge that made it possible to learn that we are stardust and products of the primary creative force in the world, which is nature's ecosphere, that has priority in time, priority in space, priority in creativity. This miraculous skin that we are hell-bent in disrupting, it will go on at a lower level of creativity for a while, just as it went on after the asteroid hit in the Yucatan 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs, and then made way for the mammals and eventually humans. It will go on. Its creative powers will continue. But the likelihood of us being here to be a part of that creative process is diminished with an increase in the erosion of our topsoil. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.